Hello everyone. When everyone found out that these girls were being hunted like wild animals, left in the jungle, no one could believe it. So let's learn a little more about today's case, which revolves around Robert. This story begins with an exotic dancer named Cindy Paulson. When Cindy Paulson was 17 years old, she moved from her home in Anchorage, Alaska, to work as a prostitute and an exotic dancer. This was around 1983. The mining fields in Alaska were booming, and the number of workers was significantly increasing. Men who were away from their families and wives loved to visit these exotic dancers to pass the time. In return, these dancers or prostitutes also made a lot of good money. Furthermore, at that time, the Alaska government was not enforcing any laws regarding this work. Instead, they were quite lenient toward bars and all these setups. One such night, a man named Robert Hansen approached Cindy. He offered her $200 for a blowjob. At first, Cindy thought this was a lot of money for such a small thing, but when she looked closely at the man, she noticed he lacked confidence and that this was perhaps the first time he was approaching an exotic dancer. That's why he didn't know about the prices. So Cindy took the $300 and agreed to go with him. When she asked for his name, he replied, "My name is Robert Hansen." Robert then told Cindy to get into his car. And as soon as Cindy sat in his car, Robert shot her in the head with a .357 Magnum gun. Then he handcuffed her hands and took her to his home, where he locked Cindy in his basement, handcuffing her to a pole in the corner. For several days, he assaulted Cindy. She couldn't even stop him because her hands were tied. At first, she tried to kick Robert, but at some point during the assault, Cindy's body became so weak that she couldn't even move. Then Robert assaulted her several more times. After a point, he began talking to Cindy, telling her about his life and showing her the hunting heads kept in his basement, most of which were deer, moose, and other animals found in Alaska. Robert told Cindy that he loved hunting, and that hunting was the only time he felt alive. Robert had no intention of leaving Cindy alive. Cindy knew that after exploiting her, he would kill her. So she started waiting for an opportunity. A few days after keeping Cindy in his home, Robert took her to an airstrip where his airplane was parked. Robert had handcuffed Cindy's hands and knew she didn't have the energy to resist. He left her in the car while he started loading his belongings into the plane. Seeing this opportunity, Cindy escaped. As soon as Robert saw her run, he shouted, "Cindy, stop. If I catch you, I'll blow your head off." But Cindy didn't stop. And despite the circumstances, she kept running without looking back. She was heading towards 5th Avenue, and as she reached the road, luckily, a driver appeared in front of her. The driver stopped the car and asked, "Are you okay?" Cindy approached the car, opened the door, and quietly got in, trying to hide. With her hands bound in front, it was a bit difficult for her to hide under the seat. Seeing all this, the driver understood that the girl was in trouble. So without thinking or asking Cindy anything, he quickly drove away from there. After a while, without saying a word, this driver took Cindy to a motel, booked a room for her, and as soon as they entered the room, Cindy locked the door from the inside. When the receptionist saw Cindy in this condition, her clothes were torn, she was barefoot, and there were many bruises on her face. She immediately called the police. When the police arrived, they questioned Cindy, and surprisingly, she shared everything. Cindy told them how Robert had attacked her and how after the assault he had taken her to Merrill Field. She also provided a description of Robert's house, particularly the basement, and even mentioned how many deer and moose heads were in the basement. Upon hearing Cindy's account, the policeman decided to check the location and arrived at Merrill Field. To their surprise, the security guard at Merrill Field had also noted the suspicious activities of Robert and had written down the license tag of his vehicle, along with the plane's ownership details. This made it easy for the police to find Robert Hansen. When the police arrived at Robert's house, they found everything to be completely normal, which was the opposite of their expectations. Robert welcomed the police into his home and even allowed them to check it, which matched Cindy's description. In fact, his basement also aligned with Cindy's description. Robert told the police that he owned a local bakery and had lived in this town for many years. The police then asked Robert if he knew any girl named Cindy, to which he replied no. When they inquired where he had been for the past 2 days, he said he had gone to his 2 friends' houses. The police confirmed this claim with both friends. In fact, Robert was married, and his wife also confirmed that he had been at his friends' houses for the last 2 days. After learning all this information, the police believed Robert and let him go, thinking that Cindy only knew his address, which didn't prove that she had ever been inside or that Robert had assaulted her. The policeman also felt that perhaps this was all a figment of Cindy's imagination. Since Cindy had no proof, her story was closed at that time. But who was Robert Hansen? He was born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa. Robert was the eldest of two children. His mother was American and his father was Danish. His mother's name was Aidan Margaret Hansen, and his father's name was Chris Hansen, who owned a bakery in Iowa. From a very young age, Robert learned about bakery business and food making, partly out of his own interest and partly due to his father. Chris Hansen, Robert's father, was a short-tempered and angry man who kept Robert in check, intentionally putting him through activities to make him strong. But he never thought about whether Robert was ready for it or not. He would just wake Robert up in the morning and keep him busy in the bakery until it was time for school. They made him work in the bakery and scolded and beat him a lot, which caused Robert to develop a stutter. Robert had always been very shy, and he would stutter while speaking, to fuel his anxiety even more. He also had acne during his childhood, which left permanent scars on his face that didn't go away as he grew up. This continued to fuel his anxiety. I can relate to this because, due to having acne, not looking good, and being short, Robert's confidence completely vanished, and the girls in his class wouldn't even talk to him, let alone look at him. Well, it wasn't just because of his looks, it was also due to his introversion and lack of social skills. Normally, he couldn't talk to anyone, but Robert always felt that people treated him badly just because of his looks and height. So, because he had no friends, Robert started learning hunting and archery along with working at the bakery. According to his family, he was enjoying himself at that time. He was actually happy with life, but Robert was bullied a lot at school and could never approach the girls he tried to talk to. In his head, he always pitied himself and thought that everyone was bad just because they didn't want to talk to him because he didn't look good, which didn't seem fair to him, probably because he was a kid, and kids care a lot about looks. However, Robert was very conscious about his appearance, and this denial from people at his school led to many wrongful things. Therefore, Robert was always resentful toward his schoolmates. After finishing school, Robert didn't have many goals. So after his dad's recommendation, he enlisted in the United States Army, where he served for a year. After that, he got discharged. It's unclear why he was discharged from there, but a year later, Robert returned to Iowa town, and here for the first time, he started dating a young girl. Upon returning to Iowa, Robert also began working as an assistant drill instructor at the police academy, which was well respected by others. After dating for 2 years, Robert married this girl in 1960. Everything in Robert's life was peaceful and good, but all the pent-up anger he had came back, and he started going down a wrong path. On December 7, 1960, Robert's old high school suddenly caught fire. The fire was massive, and the school's garage entrance and 2 classrooms burned down. When the fire department arrived, they discovered that the fire had not been caused by a fault but was deliberately set. Robert had done all this because he wanted to take revenge on the school for his humiliation. And according to him, if he burned down the school completely, his inner anger would also burn away. Thankfully, no one was at the school that day, and no one was injured because everyone had gone to a basketball game in town. That's when Robert put on his firefighter suit. With a 5-gallon gasoline tank, he set fire to the school. He was also a firefighter, a job he easily got after serving in the Army before. But Robert was sentenced to 3 years in jail for this act. During Robert's inspection, a psychiatrist diagnosed him with manic depression with periodic psychotic episodes. They believed that Robert was suffering from a fragmented personality and was still obsessed with his old life, his school life, wanting to harm every child and teacher who lived in that school. After knowing all this, after learning about Robert's past and his actions, his first wife left him in the midst of his arrest. A few months after leaving Robert, she remarried. Apparently, Robert wasn't greatly affected by his divorce, and just a few months after being released from jail, he got married again. He had a daughter with his second wife, but in the coming years, until 1967, Robert was arrested several times for petty theft, public rage, and creating scenes. Then, in 1967, Robert and his second wife moved from Iowa to Anchorage, Alaska, where he thought of starting a new life. Robert was quite liked by the people in his neighborhood in Anchorage because he had been hunting since childhood. In fact, in Alaska, where he lived, hunting was the main pastime for the locals. It wouldn't be right to call it a village, but in 1967 it was more like the countryside. Since this place was famous for hunting, the local pastime was hunting too. All the men in his neighborhood would go hunting with Robert, and he started to become a part of their group. He began to share conversations and became known as a good guy in that neighborhood. He was becoming a good man for his wife and child as well. However, 3 years after getting married and having a child, Robert began to fall back into his old ways. He was arrested twice in 1971, first for the abduction and rape of a housewife, and second for the abduction of a prostitute. Robert claimed that he was just watching the housewife, and when she came at him with a knife to attack him, he grabbed her hand. He said all of this in his defense, yet he was still sentenced to 5 years in jail. Suddenly, just after spending 6 months in jail, he was released on work release. But then, at the place where while working at that place, Robert started stealing things, and in 1976, he pleaded guilty to stealing a chain. He was requested to be treated for bipolar disorder because during that time, Robert kept insisting that he hadn't done any of those things. He couldn't even remember when he had stolen anything. At this point, Robert Hansen's crimes were minor, excluding the abduction and assault. By minor, I mean that in 1976, he wasn't committing any major offenses, he was just stealing things or getting into fights. However, nobody could imagine that Robert was committing much more serious crimes in the shadows. This is just a side note, but the police believed that Robert Hansen had started his serious crimes in 1976. However, according to reports, Robert Hansen had begun his criminal activities 5 years prior. People came to know about all of Robert's deeds after the update regarding Cindy. Robert Hansen had started his killings in 1971. His pattern was that he would pick up hitchhikers or prostitutes in his car or give them a lift. As soon as these girls sat in his car, he would intimidate them with a gun and then take them to his home, where he would exploit them. As I mentioned earlier, Robert had a daughter with his second wife in 1972, but after his daughter turned 1, Robert became very distant from his own family, spending most of his time hunting deer and moose. He did the same thing with some girls after exploiting them. He would let them go in the forest or outside his house. When these girls would run away in the woods or try to escape, he would hunt them down with a gun or a knife. Imagine someone playing hide and seek with you, but the end result is that if you get caught, you will die. It is believed that Robert Hansen's first murder was in 1971, involving a girl named Celia Vell Johnson, who was just 18 years old. One day, Celia suddenly disappeared, and her body was later found in a frozen forest. Presumably, when she tried to escape from Hansen, she hid in the woods but didn't realize how much the temperature dropped at night, leading to her death. From here, the investigation revealed Robert Hansen's victim list. Initially, this list was very short because nobody knew how many girls Robert Hansen had killed in the first place. Secondly, no one knew when Robert Hansen had started his killings. But in this initial list, there were 18 girls whose ages ranged from 17 to 41. The first victim was Celia Beth Vell Johnson, who was just 18 and died after getting lost in the forest right after Robert had been hunting. The second was Megan Emmerich, who was 17 years old and disappeared on July 7, 1973. Robert was suspected of Megan's death, even though he was at the same place with his plane where Megan was. Then there was Mary Kathleen Hill, who was 22 years old and disappeared in Seward, Alaska. Robert abducted her from his bakery. Robert admitted that he had killed Mary and had thrown her body into Resurrection Bay. In 1980, Annie was found lying next to the line, but not much evidence was obtained from Annie's body because Robert had hunted her down. When captured, he had stabbed Annie multiple times in the back. Joanna Messina, a 24-year-old exotic dancer, had actually gone to dinner with Robert, and Robert shot Joanna. Roxanne Eland, who was 24 years old, vanished, and her body was never found. However, Robert accepted that he had killed Roxanne. Lisa Footle, who was 41 years old, had actually met Robert in a nightclub, but then Robert abducted her as well. Initially, Lisa's friends thought she was going home with Robert, but she never returned, and 4 years later, Lisa's body was found buried under a bridge. Sherry Morrow, who was 23 years old, was promised $300 by Robert in exchange for nude photos. Sherry had told her friends that she was going to meet a photographer again, but Sherry never returned home. On September 12th, some hunters discovered a shallow grave next to the Nick River, which belonged to Sherry Morrow. Following this, the police investigated her body. The investigation revealed that there were 3 gunshots to the back of her head, fired from a .223 Ruger Mini 14 hunting rifle, the same rifle that Robert used. Another thing about Sherry's body was that she had gunshots in her back, but there were no holes in her clothing, so the police concluded that she had been shot in the nude and then dressed and buried afterward. Andrea Mina, who was 24 years old, had also been abducted by Robert and, using the same gun, was assaulted and then killed. Sui Luna, a 23-year-old exotic dancer, was asked by Robert to take photos for $300. After abducting and assaulting Sui, Robert told her to run into the woods near Nick River, where he hunted her down and killed her. Robin Palke was a 19-year-old girl, and her body was found just yesterday on April 25, 1984. Because so much time had passed, no concrete evidence was found to prove that Robert had killed Robin. Robin was missing even when there were only 2 hours left. Ronnie Frey, who was 22 years old, also disappeared suddenly one day, and her body was found near the Nick River. Paula Golding, a 30-year-old exotic dancer, was killed by Robert in the same manner as Sherry Morrow, shot with a gun. After killing her, he dressed her body. Malai Larson, a 28-year-old exotic dancer, was also reported missing, and her body was found near the Nick River. Teresa Watson, who was 22 years old, was offered $300 by Robert for nude photos, but then she suddenly went missing. Robert played his perverted hunting game with Teresa as well, and was found only after he chased her into the woods. After assaulting Teresa, her condition was so bad that Robert knew she wouldn't be able to run anymore, so he left her in the woods, where she froze to death. 24-year-old Angelina Lynn Feder was also an exotic dancer whom Robert kidnapped and then discarded her body in a figure-8 position after killing her. The last was 20-year-old Tammy Peterson, who was a dancer in a nightclub in Anchorage, where Robert often went. She experienced the same fate as Angelina. This information later came to light in reports, but Robert Hansen marked each girl's body on a map. Some reporters believed that this map was actually not Robert Hansen's but belonged to the police, who marked the locations of the bodies for their convenience. However, nothing is clear about the map's origin, so you are free to think about it on your own. As the police were building Robert Hansen's case, they learned some things about him. Robert kept an item from each girl as a souvenir after every killing. If you've seen my other videos, you'll know that many serial killers do this. I don't know why, but serial killers think that keeping items serves as their trophy or souvenir, which helps them remember those moments. But for Robert, it was just a souvenir. With the help of these items, he would relive the moment when he killed those girls, which is just disgusting. Another thing the police found out was that Robert punished most of the girls. The punishment was not in the sense that he killed these girls, as he was already doing that. In Robert's mind, the punishment was that he was serving justice for prostitutes or these exotic dancers. According to Robert, he only killed those girls who were bad if a dancer in the club approached him first. He thought they were dirty in their eyes. Therefore, to teach them a lesson, Robert would abduct them. But being an exotic dancer didn't justify Robert's actions. Robert actually could have escaped this case, but when the police matched the gunshots and found that Robert had only one hunting rifle, it was clear that Robert was the killer otherwise. There was a very good chance he could have escaped this case. After Robert's arrest, he faced charges of assault, kidnapping, multiple weapon offenses, and theft. After all these charges, Robert entered a plea bargain when his gun's bullets matched those found with the girls. Despite all this evidence, he was charged only for the deaths of 4 girls, Morrow, Messina, Golding, and Annie, which followed. Robert also provided details about his other victims. He himself showed investigators the graves of 17 girls, 12 of whom were not even in police records, basically unknown. According to Robert's stories, he had killed not 18, not 22, but 37 girls, most of whom were prostitutes. Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He was first imprisoned at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg in 1988 and died on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75 at the Alaska Regional Hospital due to poor health conditions. Robert Hansen's childhood was very troubled. It is clear that his insecurity had taken such a horrific form that he began killing people, wanting to take revenge on them always. But one very important aspect that we missed in this was Chris Hansen. Chris Hansen was Robert's dad, who was strict with him since childhood. Robert also claimed that he was bullied more by his father than by bullies at school. Just in one scenario, in 1971, when Robert started his bakery, after which he was arrested, Chris, his dad, sold Robert's bakery to buy a mansion for himself. I'm not saying that the entire fault lies with Chris Hansen. Of course, Robert is his own person with his own thoughts and goals, but maybe if his dad had been more understanding, maybe so many girls' lives wouldn't have been lost. And with that, Robert Hansen's case ends here. Again, guys, it's August, so I hope that you are achieving what you want. If you like watching true crime documentaries, then please subscribe to me. And with that, I hope that you all are happy. I hope that you all keep your loved ones very close to you. And I will see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.